In 1983, Harlan County, Kentucky sat bone dry under a sun that had forgotten mercy. The creeks had pulled back to their muddy centers by June, and by August they were nothing but cracked earth and memory. 72 consecutive days without rain. The corn came up stunted, then twisted, then gave up altogether. Soybeans never reached knee height. The county extension office recorded it as the worst growing season since the Dust Bowl years, and even the old-timers who had lived through those times shook their heads slowly and said they'd never seen the red clay look quite so defeated. The banks noticed before most of the farmers did. First National Savings of Corbin had already sent out 43 certified letters by the end of July. Foreclosure proceedings. Missed payments. Insufficient collateral. The language of the letters was formal and clean, the kind of language that had never once touched actual soil, never smelled diesel at 5 in the morning, never felt the particular heartbreak of walking a field that wouldn't give. It was into the summer that the auction signs went up on the Alderman place. Hand-painted on plywood, the signs appeared at the end of County Road 14 on a Tuesday morning, nailed to fence posts and the old elm by the cattle gate. Estate auction, September 3rd, all farm equipment, livestock, and personal property. There was a phone number at the bottom, and below that, in smaller letters that almost seemed ashamed of themselves, real estate to follow pending bank review. Everyone in town knew what that meant. Raymond Alderman had died in March, just before planting season, which some people said was either the best or the worst timing depending on how you looked at it. He was 78 years old and had farmed those 412 acres since he came back from Korea in 1953 with a slight tremor in his left hand and a stubbornness in his jaw that never left him. His wife, Dottie, had passed 4 years before him. Their son, Gary, lived in Cincinnati and sold insurance and had not spent a meaningful night on that farm in 20 years. Gary Alderman was the one who had called the auction house. He arrived in town the Friday before the sale in a clean white Ford Bronco with Ohio plates, wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt the color of a swimming pool. He shook hands at the diner with the auction coordinator, a heavy-set man named Dale Ferris who wore a canvas vest with too many pockets and talked about liquidation values with the same easy comfort other men used to discuss the weather. "Place's run down," Gary told Dale over coffee. "Daddy didn't keep up with things these last few years. The equipment's old. Might not bring what we hope." Dale nodded and wrote something on his clipboard. "The land'll be the value," he said. "Even dry as it is." "The bank's already got a number in mind," Gary said. Nobody at the counter said anything, though 2 or 3 people were listening. That was the way of small towns. You absorbed information like the ground absorbed what little rain fell. Slowly, carefully, without waste. The morning of the auction came in cool and gray, which was almost a relief after the weeks of brutal heat. Cars and trucks began arriving before 7, parking along the fence lines and in the dead grass of the side pasture. People came from 3 counties over for a sale like this. Dealers who bought old iron and resold it. Neighbors who needed a disc harrow or a set of fence posts. Curiosity seekers who just wanted to walk through another man's life and see what it amounted to in the end. There were maybe 200 people on the property by the time Dale Ferris climbed up on the flatbed trailer that served as his stage and tapped the microphone. Standing off near the back fence, away from the main crowd, was a woman most people didn't pay much attention to at first. Her name was Cora Suttles, and she was 61 years old, and she had driven 17 miles from her own small farm over in the Stony Gap community before sunrise that morning. She was a slight woman, narrow through the shoulders, with gray-streaked hair pulled back under a faded ball cap that said DeKalb Seed on the front. She wore work boots and a canvas jacket, and she carried a small spiral notebook in her jacket pocket, the kind you could buy at the drugstore for 79 cents. She had been writing in it since she parked her truck. People who noticed her at all assumed she was there to bid on small items. Hand tools, maybe. Canning jars. The kind of thing a farm widow might need. They were not entirely wrong about the widow part. Her husband, Earl Suttles, had died 8 years prior from a heart attack he suffered while pulling a stuck tractor out of a low-lying field. He was 54 years old. Cora had been farming alone since then, all 83 acres of it, with help from her nephew Marcus during planting and harvest and not much else. She ran a small cow-calf operation, kept a kitchen garden, sold sweet corn at the farmer's market in town on Saturday mornings, and made ends meet in the way that farm women have always made ends meet, through constant, quiet, unannounced labor that the world rarely stops to name. She had saved for 3 years for this auction. Not a large savings. $11,200, kept in a Folgers coffee can in the back of her pantry, behind the quart jars of green beans. But she had a number in her head, and a purpose, and she had driven those 17 miles in the dark with both of them fixed firmly in her mind. Dale Ferris started with the small equipment and worked his way up. Hay rakes and fence stretchers and a set of like new stock panels that went quickly. An old cultivator that 2 men got into a bidding war over before one of them gave up at $320. A chest freezer. 2 chest freezers. A wall of hand tools that were sold in lots, and a riding lawn mower that wouldn't start and went for $40 to a man who said he could fix anything. Cora wrote things down in her notebook and watched and did not bid on anything. By 10 o'clock they had moved to the tractors. Raymond Alderman had run a mixed operation for most of his life, and his tractor collection showed the history of it. There was a 1967 John Deere 4020 that was the obvious prize of the morning, freshly painted, or at least freshly touched up, and Gary Alderman had clearly hoped it would draw the kind of money that would make Dale Ferris slap his clipboard in satisfaction. It drew 4 dealers and a contentious 20 minutes of back and forth bidding before going to a man from Laurel County for $9,000. People clapped. Gary Alderman wrote something in his phone. There was an older Farmel, a Ford 8N that needed work, a small utility tractor with a front loader. These came and went. Then Dale Ferris said, "All right, folks, we're gonna move over to the barn now. Got a few pieces in there and then we'll talk about the property itself." The crowd migrated. It was the barn that people had been quietly curious about all morning, because the barn was the oldest structure on the property, built sometime in the 1890s if the county records were right, and it had a particular kind of beauty that old barns have when they've been maintained just enough to stand without being maintained enough to lose their character. The boards were weathered silver gray. The roof had a slight sag on the south side but held. The big main doors were open and the inside smelled of dry hay and machine oil and the specific dusty sweetness of old wood that has spent a century breathing. But the thing everyone noticed was the loft. The loft door up on the east wall was padlocked. Not a new padlock. An old one, heavy and dark with age. And unlike the main floor of the barn, which had been cleared and organized for the auction, the loft showed no signs of having been touched. Gary Alderman had mentioned to Dale Ferris that he couldn't find the key and that the loft was probably empty anyway and they should just sell what was accessible and let the new owner deal with the rest. People stood in the barn and looked up at that locked loft door and talked about it in the low way people talk when something catches their imagination. "Probably nothing up there," said a man in a John Deere hat. "Old Raymond was peculiar about that loft," said an older woman who turned out to be his neighbor from 2 farms down. "Kept it locked long as I can remember. Even when we were kids. Used to say it wasn't for general use." "Could be anything," said another man. "Old stuff. Junk. Maybe nothing." Cora Suttles was standing near the barn wall, out of the flow of people. She was looking at the loft door. She had been looking at it for several minutes. She was also looking at something else that most people had walked past without noticing. Along the north wall of the barn, beneath a canvas tarp that had mostly slid off, there was a planter. An old one. She walked over to it slowly and crouched down and pulled the tarp the rest of the way back and looked at it for a long time without speaking. It was a John Deere planter, vintage, for row, and it was in remarkable condition. Not flashy. Not restored. Just maintained. The kind of maintenance that didn't come from money but from attention. Someone had kept moisture off the seat plates, kept the drive chains oiled, kept the row cleaners from rusting through. This machine had been put away correctly every single season it was used. "Whatcha looking at?" said a younger man who'd wandered over. "Planter," Cora said. "Old one," the man said, losing interest. Cora said. She didn't say what she was actually thinking, which was that this planter, based on the model and the condition, was likely set up for a very specific purpose. She had seen the configuration before, though not often. It was set for narrow row spacing, precision spacing, the kind of thing you used when you were planting under very specific soil conditions. She thought about the fields she'd driven past on the way in, the way the old corn rows were oriented on the Alderman property, and something in her mind was doing slow and careful arithmetic. She wrote something in her notebook. Dale Ferris sold 2 more pieces of equipment and then announced a short break. People drifted to the tables where Gary Alderman's wife, a tired-looking woman named Cheryl who had said approximately nothing to anyone all morning, was serving coffee from large aluminum percolators. Cora walked over to the older neighbor woman she'd seen earlier, the one who'd mentioned Raymond's loft. "You knew Raymond well?" Cora asked. The woman, who introduced herself as Betty Combs, was in her mid-70s with sharp eyes and a firm handshake. 40 years of neighboring, Betty said. "You're Earl Suttles' wife." "Widow," Cora said. "Yes. I remember Earl. Good man. He was." "You farming still?" "Every day," Cora said. "What did Raymond do with that north section? The low ground along the creek?" Betty looked at her with a new kind of attention. "Why do you ask that?" "Just curious how he worked it." Betty studied her for a moment. "He kept that ground in a particular grass mixture for about 15 years. Let it restore. People thought he was crazy, leaving that acreage sit. But the last 3 years before he got sick, he was getting the best corn yields in the county off that ground. Extension agent came out and took samples. Wouldn't tell Raymond much he didn't already know." Cora nodded slowly, looking into her coffee. "And the loft," she said. Betty glanced toward the barn. "Raymond used to say his grandfather built the loft to hold what mattered most on a farm. Wasn't talking about hay." "What was he talking about?" "Seeds," Betty said simply. "Old varieties. Things his grandfather brought over. Things he'd saved himself over 60 years of farming. He had a system up there, Raymond did. Temperature, moisture, all of it managed as careful as you'd manage a hospital room. His daddy taught him how and his grandfather before that." She paused. "Gary doesn't know what's in that loft. Or doesn't care. I'm not sure which is worse." Cora was quiet for a moment. "Thank you, Betty," she said. When Dale Ferris climbed back on his flatbed to resume, Cora made her way through the crowd to where Gary Alderman was standing with his phone in his hand. "Mr. Alderman," she said. "My name is Cora Suttles. I farm over in Stony Gap. I knew your father a little." Gary looked at her with the polite vacancy of someone who has had 30 conversations already this morning and is tired of all of them. "I'd like to make an offer on the planter under the tarp," Cora said. "Before it goes to auction. And I'd like to discuss the loft." "The loft's locked," Gary said. "I know it is. I'd like to buy whatever's in it. Sight unseen." Gary looked at her more carefully now. "You don't know what's in it." "I have a fair idea," Cora said. "How much?" Gary said. "That depends on what you tell me the bank needs from this sale," Cora said. "And what's left after everything else sells today?" Gary stared at her. There was something in her voice, not aggressive, not particularly warm either, just level, like a well-calibrated instrument, that made him set his phone in his pocket. "Why don't we talk after the sale?" he said. "All right," Cora said. The auction ran until early afternoon. The Alderman Farms equipment, livestock, and personal property brought a total of $41,000 by the time Dale Ferris dropped his gavel the last time and stepped down from his flatbed with a satisfied look on his face. The real estate itself, 412 acres of Harlan County farmland, some good, some tired, all of it dry as a conversation with the bank, had a reserve price set by First National Savings, and there was serious interest from 2 parties. One was a man from Lexington who represented a land investment group. The other wore a suit and said very little and took many photographs with a professional-looking camera. Gary Alderman stood by his Bronco at 2:30 in the afternoon and did the math he'd been doing all day. The bank needed a specific number. The auction had gotten partway there. The land sale would likely get the rest. The loft and the old planter were afterthoughts. Cora came back to him as the crowd was thinning. She had her notebook open. "I'll give you $2,000 for the planter and whatever's in the loft," she said. Gary frowned. "That seems low." "It might be," Cora said. "If what I think is up there is actually up there. But you don't know what's up there and you can't get up there to find out, and the auction's done, and I'm the one standing here with a number." She paused. 2,000 closes out your day clean. You go back to Cincinnati with the loft off your books, the planter off your books, and 2,000 in your pocket you didn't have this morning. Gary looked at his wife, Cheryl, who was loading a box of coffee supplies into the Bronco and who offered him no expression of any kind. "You got cash?" Gary said. Cora reached into her jacket pocket and brought out an envelope. It took Dale Ferris 20 minutes to find a bolt cutter long enough to handle the old padlock. When it finally gave way and the loft door swung open, the small group that had gathered, Betty Combs, Dale Ferris, Gary Alderman, and 2 or 3 people who'd lingered out of instinct, looked up into the loft and went quiet. It was organized with a precision that was almost painful to see. Wooden shelving, built with care, ran the full length of both long walls. On the shelves were jars. Hundreds of them. Mason jars, ball jars, old-style jars with glass lids and rubber seals, all of them labeled in Raymond Alderman's careful handwriting with a black grease pencil. The labels carried names that didn't appear in any seed catalog currently printed in the United States. Bloody Butcher corn. Turkey craw bean. Mortgage lifter tomato. Jimmy red corn. Greasy cut short bean. Heirloom varieties, some of them going back 100 years in Appalachian farming tradition, some of them representing genetic lines that commercial agriculture had abandoned decades ago in favor of high-yield hybrids. Raymond Alderman had spent 60 years collecting and saving and storing these seeds. He had kept them dry, cool, dark. He had tested germination every few years and replaced what had aged past viability. He had, in the language of seed preservation, done everything right. Betty Combs put her hand over her mouth. Dale Ferris said, quietly, "Lord Almighty." Gary Alderman looked at Cora Suttles with an expression she had seen before, on the faces of people who have just understood, too late, the full dimension of something they have sold short. "What is this worth?" Gary said. Cora looked at him for a moment. She thought about saying several things. She thought about telling him what she actually knew, that heirloom seed collections like this one had sold to agricultural preservation foundations and university programs for amounts that would rearrange his understanding of his afternoon. She thought about telling him about the Seed Savers Exchange, about the growing market for heritage grain varieties among craft distilleries and specialty farms, about the particular and extraordinary rarity of intact Appalachian seed traditions preserved at this scale. She did not say any of those things. "More than 2,000, she said honestly. "But it's yours. You sold it to me this morning and I paid you for it, and that's where we are." Gary opened his mouth and closed it again. "I'll tell you what I will do," Cora said. "I'll share it." Gary looked at her. "Some of these varieties," Cora said, "they need to go to people who can grow them and save them right." That's what Raymond wanted. "I'll work with the university extension, maybe the seed library program they've got over at Berea. I'll grow what I can grow on my place and I'll document it and I'll make sure it doesn't disappear." She paused. "That's what this is worth to me. It's not money." Gary was quiet for a long moment. "He never talked to me about any of this," Gary said, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before, something that had nothing to do with the auction or the bank or the numbers on Dale Ferris's clipboard. "No," Cora said. "I don't imagine he did." The drive home that evening was 17 miles back across county roads that Cora knew by heart, past fields that were someone else's and fields that were hers, past the little white church at the crossroads and the grain elevator with its rusted ladder and the abandoned filling station where she always meant to stop and look at the old pump and never did. The sky to the west was going deep orange above the tree line, and the air coming in through the truck window was cooler than it had been in weeks, and somewhere far off she thought she could smell the particular electric sharpness that sometimes precedes rain. Marcus, her nephew, was waiting at the farm when she pulled in. He was 18 and lanky and had his Uncle Earl's eyes and very little of Earl's patience yet, though Cora believed it would come in time the way all useful things come slowly, through necessity, through repeated contact with what is hard. He saw the truck bed loaded with the planter parts she'd had helped dismantling and the boxes she'd carried carefully down from the loft, and his eyebrows went up. "You buy the whole farm," he said. "Just the important parts," Cora said. She let him help carry the boxes into the cool of the equipment shed, and then she sat him down on an overturned bucket and opened one of the jars and poured a handful of seeds into her palm and held them under the shed's single working light bulb. "What are those?" Marcus said. "Jimmy red corn," Cora said. "Old variety. Before the commercial seed companies came in and convinced everybody there was only one way to grow corn. People in these mountains grew this for 200 years. She turned her hand slightly. The seeds were dark red, almost burgundy. Your Uncle Earl's grandfather probably grew something close to this. Maybe exactly this." Marcus looked at her and then looked at the seeds. "We gonna plant them?" "In the spring," Cora said. "Right kind of ground, right kind of attention. They'll grow." "How do you know?" Cora considered the question the way she considered most questions worth asking, not quickly. "Because they grew before," she said. "And because somebody kept them. That's the whole secret of farming, Marcus. Somebody always has to keep what matters through the hard years. That's all it is." She poured the seeds back into the jar and sealed it with the same care Raymond Alderman had used for 60 years, and she labeled it in her own handwriting, and she set it on the shelf she had already cleared for it. That night the rain came. It came gently at first, the way the best rains come, tentative, almost apologetic, tapping at the tin roof of the equipment shed and darkening the dust of the yard in a spreading pattern that moved from the fence line inward like something remembering how to do its job. Then it settled in, steady and serious, the kind of rain that soaks rather than runs, that goes down into the clay rather than skating across the top of it. The creek at the back of Cora's property, which had been a thin thread of itself since July, would be running full by morning. She stood on the porch in the dark and listened to it and did not think about the auction or Gary Alderman or the locked loft or the money in the Folgers can that was now considerably depleted. She thought about the seeds on the shelf in the shed, sealed in their jars, surviving as they had survived before, through drought and bad years and the deaths of the people who had tended them and the indifference of the people who came after. She thought about Raymond Alderman up on a ladder in that loft, in some year she would never know, writing a label in careful black letters for something his grandfather had handed him across the length of a life. She thought about what passes between people on this earth when it passes silently, when nobody makes a ceremony of it, when it goes from hand to hand in a barn or a field and means everything precisely because so few people understand what they are witnessing. The rain fell on her fields and on the Alderman fields 17 miles away and on the dry county roads between them and on everything that had been planted and everything that had not yet been planted and everything that would be planted in the spring when the ground was ready and the conditions were right and a woman with a small notebook and 83 acres and 11 years of solitary farming knowledge got down on her knees in a field and put something old back into the ground. In the spring, Cora planted 4 rows of Jimmy red corn on the south slope where the drainage was good, just as an experiment, just to test the germination rate and see how the seed stock had held. She planted it with the old Alderman planter she had spent the winter carefully reassembling and tuning, replacing the worn seed plates with ones she'd ordered from a farm supply house in Ohio and adjusting the row cleaners until the spacing was exactly what she wanted. Marcus drove the tractor. He was getting better at listening. By July the corn was 8 feet tall. By August it was tasseling out in the particular way of old open-pollinated varieties, which is to say exuberantly and without apology, great plumes of pollen shaking loose in the morning breeze and drifting across the row tops. The ears were long and deep red and they made you think, looking at them, that you were seeing something that had been away on a long trip and had come home. The extension agent came out in early August, a young man named Todd who was earnest and thorough and had a university degree in agronomy and who had heard about Cora's collection from his supervisor, who had heard about it from Betty Combs, who talked about it to anyone who would listen. Todd walked the corn rows slowly and said nothing for a long time. "Where did you get this variety?" he said finally. "A man kept it," Cora said. "For 60 years he kept it. In a loft. Todd looked at the corn and then at Cora and seemed to understand that there was more to this sentence than he was going to hear today, and that was all right. "We'd like to do a soil sample," he said. "And document the seed stock. If you're willing to share." "That's the whole point of seeds," Cora said. The county paper ran a small story in September. Not front page. Page 4, below the fold, the way important things often appear quietly, without drama, next to an advertisement for a tire shop in Corbin. The headline said local farmer preserves rare Appalachian seed collection, and there was a photograph of Cora in the equipment shed, holding one of Raymond's jars up to the light. She looked, in the photograph, like someone who knew exactly what she was holding. She had people call her from 3 states after the story ran. Seed preservation organizations. A university in Lexington. A small distillery in western North Carolina that was trying to source heritage grain and had been looking for Jimmy Red corn for 2 years and could not believe their luck when they found it growing on 83 acres in Harlan County, Kentucky, tended by a 62-year-old widow who had bought it for $2,000 at an estate auction during a drought. She negotiated the distillery contract herself, at her kitchen table, with her spiral notebook open and a cup of coffee at her elbow, and when the man on the other end of the phone said he thought she drove a hard bargain, she told him she'd been farming alone for 11 years and hadn't gone under yet, and he could draw his own conclusions from that. Gary Alderman called her once, in October. He didn't say much. He asked how the corn had done and she told him honestly, better than she'd expected, which was saying something because she'd expected a great deal. He was quiet for a moment and then he said his father had never talked to him about the farm in any real way, never explained it, never invited him into it. He didn't know how to invite you, Cora said. Some men don't. They show it in other ways. He kept those seeds for 60 years, Gary said. He did. For who? Cora looked out her kitchen window at the field, which was harvested now and clean and gray under the October sky, ready for winter, patient the way fields are patient, which is a kind of patience no human being fully achieves. For whoever was paying attention, she said. She saved seed from every variety she'd planted that first year, saving it with the same discipline Raymond had taught her through his example, through the labeled jars and the careful shelving and the locked loft door that had held what mattered for decades against the carelessness of the world. She saved more than she needed, which is the correct amount to save. She gave some to Betty Combs, who was too old to plant much but who cried a little when she held the turkey craw bean seeds in her hand and said her mother had grown those and she had not seen them since she was 12 years old. She gave some to Marcus, who planted a small plot of his own on a corner of her farm with a seriousness that pleased her more than she showed. She kept the rest. In the spring she would plant again. The following spring after that, she would plant again. This was not a complicated philosophy. It was not a philosophy at all, really. It was just what you did on a farm, in a county, in a state, in a country built on the accumulated stubbornness of people who understood that the land does not rescue itself, that someone has to stay, that someone has to do the small and patient work of keeping what is worth keeping through the hard years when everything else says let it go. The coffee can in the pantry, behind the quart jars of green beans, was empty now. That was all right. Money came back around if you worked honestly and didn't waste what you had. The seeds on the shelf in the equipment shed were worth more than money, which is a thing that sounds like sentiment until you understand what seeds actually are, which is time made physical, which is every good year someone ever had collapsed into a handful of something small enough to fit in your coat pocket, which is the future held carefully in the past's hands, passed forward at the cost of nothing more than attention. Outside, in the Harlan County night, it was raining again. The fields were drinking.